It started with a single rose bush and a bird feeder, just a little corner of peace I carved out of my front yard after a stressful year. I'd lost my job, my dog passed away, and the world just felt a little too loud. So I turned inward, poured my energy into planting native flowers, attracting hummingbirds, and letting the grass grow a little wilder than usual. I wasn't trying to make a statement, just wanted to breathe again. But Karen didn't see it that way. She lived across the street with her pristine lawn, perfectly trimmed hedges, and enough HOA rulebooks stacked in her garage to build a small fortress. She believed in order, structure, and above all else compliance. She absolutely loathed anything that didn't fit her rigid idea of what a neighborhood should look like. I noticed her watching me the first day I planted milkweed near my mailbox. She stood with her arms folded, lips tight, glaring at me like I'd just committed some kind of sin against suburbia. A few days later, she cornered me while I was watering a patch of wildflowers I'd seeded along the driveway. "You know, that kind of thing attracts pests," she said, motioning to my flower bed with a pointed finger. I smiled politely. "Pollinators. Mostly butterflies and bees." She didn't smile back. After that, it became a silent war. I'd catch her taking pictures of my yard with her phone, probably to build a case. One afternoon, I saw her using binoculars. No shame about it either, just standing on her porch in broad daylight, like a wildlife scout, only she wasn't spotting birds. She was looking for violations. I didn't think much of it until the letter arrived. It was official, straight from the city. I was being cited for unkempt landscaping, potential fire hazard due to overgrowth, and failure to maintain property in accordance with neighborhood standards. I stood there reading it with a hollow feeling in my stomach. My garden wasn't some overgrown jungle, it was intentional. The plants were chosen carefully, and nothing was blocking walkways or spilling into the street. But the words on that paper didn't care. They were vague but serious. I knew right away who had called it in. Karen, of course, wasn't subtle about her victories. She waved at me with exaggerated cheer the next morning while walking her tiny yapping dog, her smile wide and smug. She'd won, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that the letter didn't defeat me. It lit a fire. I could have just trimmed everything back and let the grass conform to regulation length. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to just comply, I wanted to win. And not by shouting or arguing or stooping to her level, but by outsmarting her in a way she'd never see coming. So, I went online that night and began researching local zoning laws, city codes, environmental exceptions, anything and everything. It turns out there are loopholes, big ones, and one of them was exactly what I needed. Under both state and federal guidelines, land designated as a certified wildlife habitat had certain protections. You could rewild your yard with native plants, maintain brush piles for small mammals, add water features for amphibians and birds, and, so long as it was done properly and documented, it couldn't legally be classified as unkempt. In fact, the city would have to back off completely. That was my golden ticket. Over the next few days, I started making changes. Not careless ones, strategic ones. I tore out the last bits of lawn that remained and replaced them with more native plants, coneflowers, goldenrod, bee balm, switchgrass, and clover. I installed a small recirculating pond in the corner and stacked a few logs beside it to create a microhabitat for insects and salamanders. I built a trellis with passion flower vines great for Gulf fritillary butterflies, put up 2 wooden birdhouses painted to blend into the surroundings. I applied for official certification through the National Wildlife Federation. It wasn't just a plaque or a gimmick. It came with guidance, inspections, and the kind of bureaucratic weight that makes local officials nervous to interfere. A few weeks later, the sign arrived in the mail. A dark green metal placard with white lettering. *** certified wildlife habitat, providing food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. ***. I planted it right at the edge of the yard, clearly visible from Karen's front window. Then I called the city and submitted all the paperwork, along with a copy of the certification and documentation proving that the landscaping served a registered ecological purpose. I was no longer just some guy with overgrown grass. I was now the steward of a recognized wildlife refuge. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. 2 days later, Karen struck again. This time, she called code enforcement and claimed my yard was a breeding ground for mosquitoes and rodents. I saw the city worker arrive and greeted him at the driveway, paperwork in hand. Barely made it up the walk before I handed him the folder. He looked through the contents and blinked. "So, this is certified?" I nodded, and fully compliant under state environmental protection guidelines. He flipped through the permits, muttered something about how rare this was, and apologized for the intrusion. Before leaving, he complimented the variety of birds around the pond. I told him there was a nesting pair of cardinals in the elderberry bush if he looked closely. Across the street, Karen was watching through her curtains, fuming. I could feel it. Her plan had backfired in a spectacular way. To try and shame me had ended up validating everything I was doing, and I wasn't finished yet. I ordered more plants, milkweed for the monarchs, elderberry for the birds, jopai weed for the bees. I added an informational board near the sidewalk, detailing the types of species people might spot in the yard. At night, I installed soft solar lights to illuminate the walking path and the educational sign, giving it a gentle, inviting glow. My front yard was no longer just mine. It was becoming part of the community, even if one neighbor absolutely hated it. But my favorite moment of all was still to come. It happened one evening just before sunset. I was sitting on my porch with a glass of iced tea, watching a family of rabbits nibble at the clover patch, when I noticed Karen stepping out onto her driveway. She glanced at the yard, saw the rabbits, then looked directly at me. I raised my glass and gave her a friendly wave. She turned and went back inside without a word, and I smiled, knowing full well this was only the beginning. Karen didn't back off. In fact, the wildlife certification seemed to trigger something in her, like it was a direct insult to her manicured vision of the neighborhood. She doubled down. Within days, she was back on the phone with the city, logging complaints and insisting I was harboring dangerous animals and refusing to maintain a safe residential environment. The irony wasn't lost on me. My backyard had become more organized and legally protected than half the houses on the block. But to her, it was a declaration of war. The city sent out another inspector, a different guy this time, young and clearly nervous about walking into what was becoming a well-known neighborhood conflict. I met him at the sidewalk with the same calm smile, the same stack of neatly organized paperwork. I had anticipated every angle. I pointed out the bee hotels made from hollow stems and woodblocks, the way the water feature had a recirculating pump to prevent mosquito larvae, and how each plant was listed as a native species in our state's own Department of Conservation database. He nodded a lot, scribbled some notes on his clipboard, and kept glancing across the street. Where Karen was standing with her arms crossed, radiating hostility, she said something about invasive species. He mumbled. I handed him a laminated sheet I had printed just for this occasion, a full list of every plant in the yard, all checked against the state's invasive species list, none of which were prohibited. She also mentioned aggressive animals. He added. I chuckled, stepping aside so he could get a clear view of the scene behind me. A few sparrows hopping through the brush, a fat squirrel lounging on a flat rock near the water, and a monarch butterfly fluttering lazily around a milkweed stalk. Terrifying, aren't they? Said with a grin. He stifled a laugh but tried to stay professional. Yeah, I think we're good here. After that visit, the city stopped responding to Karen's complaints. She must have made a dozen more calls over the next month, but none of them brought inspectors. Eventually, someone must have flagged her for excessive, unfounded reports. Her calls went unanswered. Her power was slipping and she knew it. Still, she didn't quit. Asterisk, she started posting passive-aggressive notes on the neighborhood Facebook group, warning parents to watch out for the wildlife-infested lot at the end of the block, accusing me of luring coyotes with open water sources and rodent-friendly habitats. People laughed at first. A few even clapped back with photos they'd taken of the butterflies or birds they'd spotted while walking by. A mother posted a picture of her toddler mesmerized by a hummingbird in my yard. Another neighbor thanked me for bringing life back to the street. What Karen hadn't expected was that the neighborhood actually liked it. Kids started dragging their parents to my yard to see the frogs or look for bunnies. I made a laminated ID guide and clipped it to the fence, showing pictures of common backyard wildlife and a list of what to look for. Parents began using my little patch of habitat as an unofficial nature walk. It became a thing. Then one day I got an email from a local elementary school teacher. She asked if her second grade class could come visit during a mini unit on ecosystems. I said yes, of course. I even prepared little laminated cards for the kids to carry around. Find this bird, spot this flower, what's buzzing near the lavender. They loved it. They were loud and curious and full of questions, and for once, my yard wasn't just a quiet retreat for MIT, it was a learning space. A living demonstration of what happens when nature is invited in. Karen, needless to say, was livid. She called the school to complain. The principal called me later, apologizing, but said the visit was considered part of a science activity and perfectly allowable. Apparently, Karen had claimed the field trip was a safety hazard and accused me of running an unlicensed petting zoo. The more she reached, the more ridiculous she looked. By that point, the city had taken a different approach. They invited me to speak at a community meeting about sustainable residential design. I gave a short presentation on how to turn lawns into low-maintenance, eco-friendly habitats. I brought handouts, pictures, and even data showing how much water I'd saved since removing the grass. A few residents asked for help starting their own butterfly gardens. One older gentleman who'd never spoken to me before dropped off. Potted milkweed with a note. Heard these are good for the monarchs. But the moment I'll never forget came a month later when I got a letter from the county office to my property certification and the documented ecological benefits. I qualified for a small but permanent reduction in property taxes. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make me laugh. Karen's constant snitching had accidentally saved me money. I framed that letter and hung it in my front hallway. By now, the yard was thriving. Birds nested in the trellis. Rabbits came and went without fear. The pond had dragonflies skimming across its surface every morning. The scent of wildflowers filled the air, and bees worked tirelessly from dawn till dusk. People walked slower, past my house now, not to gawk, but to take it all in. My yard had become an oasis, not just for wildlife, but for the neighborhood. And then came the final straw for Karen. One morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I noticed movement at the edge of the yard. A deer, slender young, was probably just wandering through, stepped out of the trees from the adjacent property and tiptoed through the clover. It paused, sniffed the air, then dipped its head to drink from the pond. Sat perfectly still, stunned by the moment's quiet beauty. Then I heard her. Karen burst out of her front door in a full-blown panic, screaming, "That thing is destroying my begonias." The deer startled and bounded away, disappearing into the trees, stood up, cup in hand, and raised it toward her in a toast. "Sorry, Karen," I called. "This is a preserve now. Nature does what it wants." She stared at me, fists clenched, at her sides, trembling with frustration. Then she turned and marched back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to shake the wind chimes on her porch. And that was the last time she tried to mess with me. Maybe she realized she'd lost. Maybe she was just tired. From then on, she stopped watching me, stopped shouting, stopped sending letters to the city. She pulled back behind her fortress of hedges and perfectly trimmed silence. Meanwhile, I kept building. I added solar lights, a rain barrel, and a sign showing migrating bird routes. I partnered with a local conservation group and opened the garden for one day during their annual eco tour. Hundreds came. Karen didn't show. And as I watched families stroll past my yard, taking pictures of butterflies, whispering to each other about how beautiful it all was, I thought about how it started. A rose bush, a bird feeder, and one very loud neighbor funny. How she tried to destroy something and ended up helping it grow bigger than either of us ever expected.